Welcome to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. Today on Ring of Fire, we'll tell you about the money behind some of the most war-hungry pundits on cable news. We'll also tell you how the FDA has become an extension of big pharma, and we'll find out what kind of damage Citizens United has done to American democracy over the last 4 years. We have all that and more coming up, but right now, just remember, you just stepped into the Ring of Fire.
You can't change Washington from the inside. You can only change it from the outside.
Grand jury secrecy rules.
For political gain.
The press can find out.
That has nothing to do with politics, but go ahead.
It wouldn't bother me.
Oops.
Cable news outlets are buzzing over a new conflict in the Middle East, but some of the biggest pro-war pimps might have a hidden agenda. New reports show that these pundits are being directly funded by the defense industry. Joining me now to talk about this story is Howard Nations. Howard, it's amazing to me. You watch these Sunday talk shows and you watch CNN and all these I call them the media war pimps. And there's no notion that the guy that's up there, the war hawk, that is selling let's go to war, whether it's ISIS, whether it's Iran, wherever it is, North Korea, whatever the war is of the day, there's no disclosure that war hawk, that guy up there in front of the camera with the media war pimp, is actually working for the arms industry, the defense industry. No disclosure at all. What do you think about that?
Well, you know, President Eisenhower very wisely warned about the military-industrial complex. Now we have an addition to that. Now we have the military and media industrial complex, where we have retired generals and politicians who are filling the airways with pressure for war. The problem is that they're presented as policy experts without disclosing any of the conflicts that you're talking about.
Not only does the TV station or the newspaper agency that's doing the interview, they don't disclose that character that's up there, like Jack Keane, for example, really good example. Jack Keane, this general, retired general, making gazillions of dollars from the defense industry, going on CNN, and the buffoon that's asking the question on CNN, or whether it's wherever it is, ABC, CBS, the buffoon's asking the question, either, this is all I can conclude, they've either been told, do not disclose that this retired general is now making a ton of money from the arms industry, or they don't have enough sense to ask the question. Which is it?
Well, you know, Mike, there's been an interesting change of pace here. Back in 2008, there was an expose from the media, the New York Times, which identified a whole network of retired generals who were on the payroll of defense contractors who were echoing Bush's ramp up in Iraq. Commentators like Jack Keane that you're talking about. Jack Keane is head of the Institute for the Study of War. That's backed by the largest, most profitable defense contractors such as Raytheon, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, and others. It also employs neocons Bill Kristol and Liz Cheney. But in Keane, for example,
and let's not miss that. Liz Cheney, understand?
Yeah, absolutely.
Old crazy Darth Vader, crazy man Cheney is on the news almost every day, beating, pounding the sound of war. You know, the same idiot that got us knowingly involved in Iraq, which has brought all of this problem with ISIS. It's created the ISIS movement. The same guy is back on CNN, and the people asking the questions of him do not have enough damn sense to ask the right questions, or the people they're worried that Boeing and McDonnell Douglas and all these advertisers that are with him are going to get mad if they ask about his relationship with them.
Well, neocons like Cheney never saw a war they didn't like. What's happened, though, the New York Times, explain this to me. The New York Times, who did the expose, now comes on with Keane and his ISW organization, and they rely on ISW for research. Since June, they've done 6 infographics in the New York Times that's made no mention of Keane's conflict and no mention of ISW's vested interest. So this is the great exposer has now become complicit.
Mm-hmm. Well, we can go on forever with these people. These are names to look out for. Jack Keane, General Jack Keane. If you see him, you know it's a plant by the industry. You know that the person asking the question, the journalist asking the question, either has been told, do not disclose that he's making money from the industry, or they don't have enough sense to ask the question. Let me give you another name. Francis Townsend, former Bush administration official, all just rolling in the dough, rolling in the money and the relationships with the arms industry. She's a regular on CNN. And I'd like, if you're watching, count how many times CNN ever asked the question, well, Ms. Townsend, don't you have a direct interest in this since you're making money from this when you're telling us we have to go to war? I don't get it. But the problem is the average person doesn't know all this, do they? No, not at all. And Keane, for example, is an advisor to Academics, which is the former Blackwater. He's a board member of General Dynamics, where he was paid $250,000 last year. Now you go on down to General Anthony Zinni, who is the biggest proponent among the military retired, who has asked for 10,000 boots on the ground to fight ISIS. He is also a board member of Defense Contractors. He works for private equity firms specializing in military investments. General James Mattis, who is in the Washington Post now. We're talking about the pinnacles of integrity in the media. Washington Post, the New York Times. They're criticizing Obama's decision. Mattis was criticizing Obama's decision to not to employ troops to fight ISIS. He serves on the board, on the General Dynamics board with General Keane. No mention of that in the Post. So the Post, Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times, CNN, they've all become complicit in this. And as you say, they're not asking the questions. Well, there's a reason for it. Lee Fong just does a great job doing a story that lays all this out. He's always somebody that you can count on. I always urge people to read what Lee Fong writes about stories like this. But the Lee Fong is unequivocal at the fact, unequivocal of the statement and the story that the media knows exactly what they're doing, just like they knew when they had all these war pimps show up for Iraq. What they found was for every I think it was 20 hours that they would have somebody pro-war, they had something like 15 minutes of somebody that was talking about the other side of it, because the media makes money on war. Of course they get viewership on war. The advertisers that are McDonnell Douglas and Boeing types, they are pumping money into the media to keep the story up. And we sit there and we send our families, our sisters and brothers and fathers over to die for a war like Iraq was basically useless. You're absolutely right. The problem right now is there are too many conflicts of interest in the media, and it's the networks who are bringing the pundits to speak on ISIS for a military ramp up. It's the networks that are not disclosing conflicts of interest, sources of income. The American people have a right to know if the general that they're hearing on the network or in the newspaper or writing the editorial like Keane did in the New York Times, if they're shilling for the defense contractors and promoting profitable military action and endangering American lives. We would hope so, but that's not reality nowadays. Howard Nations, thank you for joining me, okay? My pleasure, Mike. President Obama recently announced that he wouldn't be taking action on the issue of immigration reform until after the midterm elections. And since neither party has been able to come up with a plan, militia groups have decided to handle the crisis on their own in their own violent and dangerous way. Joining me now to explain what's happening is author David Neiwert. David Neiwert is the author of the book, And Hell Followed With Her. You know, it's amazing to me that, David, that the failure of these organizations, they're either incompetent or there simply is there's no demand by the public to get behind them. These organizations that have tried to stop immigration there on the borders with, whether it's roadblocks or arms blocks or whatever it is, they're always saying, we're going to stop it, we're going to go down there, have a demonstration, and then nothing ever happens. What's the latest that's happened in these these patriot types that have gone, these militia types that have gone and tried to stop immigration?
Well, one of the outfits that we've actually had a group of militiamen down on the border in the Brownsville area, and they've been running a camp called Camp Lone Star. And these are the guys that have had run-ins with border patrolmen and so on and so forth. A couple of the characters from this outfit actually went off on their own. There was the usual internecine disputes at Camp Lone Star. And so this guy went off, and a couple of other people that had been organizing the militias down there tried to do this campaign where they were going to close all the ports of entry on Saturday. And it was supposed to be this mass protest where you had all these truckers pulling up to the ports and turning off their engines and walking away. But as far as we could tell, they never really had any support. They didn't seem to have any support from their fellow patriots. The Oath Keepers were supposedly involved, but they never actually officially made any indication of it. And so on Saturday, the people who organized this decided to announce that they were calling it off. And the excuse that they gave was that they were supposedly under extreme threat from the drug cartels who were threatening to make it a bloodbath if they did this. Which,
of course, just absolute nonsense. I mean, really, what this is, and I just love the way you've covered this, because you've always tried to give them a fair shake. These right. Pete Santilli groups. Pete Santilli, in the stories that I've followed you talk about the idea this is the guy from Ground Zero that year in, year out, along with this Barth woman, are trying to convince the American public that there's this huge groundswell of support behind them, and that when they do something, by golly, the Border Patrol agrees with them, the Texas Rangers agree with them, the Homeland Security agrees with them, and the American public agrees with them. But then they try to pull it off, and nobody ever shows up. I mean, we're looking at the third time this has happened, where they've made these great, grandiose statements and nothing happens. This time they're blaming it on the drug cartels, which is fantasy, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, these are guys who, one of the guys who runs Camp Lone Star keeps claiming that he's number 5 on the drug cartel's hit list and so on and so forth. And he's just this kind of not very well-to-do guy who has some property there on the border and calls it a ranch, I guess. But that's where these guys have set up camp. And and they're all, a lot of, they use the cartels as an excuse for all kinds of things. They had this scene with Santilli's caravan where they supposedly had to evacuate a hotel at 4 a.m. because these militiamen came around and said, you guys are about to be set up by a cartel ambush and we got to get you out of here. And it was this bizarre paranoid game where they all fled this hotel at 4 a.m.
I follow. It's almost, they dress, okay, first of all, they dress up like they have some, long-term military experience, policing experience. They don't. They this idea of them using their arms, there's these guns and riding around their horses and their jeeps. It almost, as you watch it, you almost come away thinking these are delusional kind of teenage sophomoric thinkers. They watch these movies, for example, where they emulate this character in a movie, even in the way they talk, the way they present what they're doing. It's almost like they've watched too many movies and they're so delusional they don't understand it's all fantasy.
Yeah. They often have difficulty separating fantasy from reality, mostly because they kind of live in a fantasy world anyway. And that kind of reflects, I think, equally on their thinking on immigration. These guys don't seem to understand that actually the numbers of border crossers have dropped precipitously in the last 6 years. And so they're waving this flag and saying we've got all these people coming over the border. We really don't. What we've had is this increase in child refugees from Central America, a pretty dramatic increase in that. And that's what these guys are all on about.
One thing that's interesting to me, David, as I read your material, I know you've written and we've talked about this in the past, it's almost like the one hand of the real immigration nuts don't know what the other hand of the real immigration nuts are doing. For example, one hand of the immigration nuts is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is dying to have workers come into this company that will work for below minimum wages, that will work in sweatshop conditions. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce wants this influx of people. They don't say it publicly because they don't want to say that what they're trying to do is they're trying to play both sides of the fence. But there's no question that U.S. Chamber of Commerce is promoting this. They've actually met with President Obama to try to say to him, hey, let him come in. Our companies want cheap labor. And then the worker out there is saying, well, gee whiz, I didn't know the U.S. Chamber of Commerce was doing this because it's so well hidden by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
Yeah. Well, that's right. And, of course, those are the same forces that actually want to enforce the status quo. It's why we can't get any kind of sensible immigration reform passed, partly because, I mean, these guys are all on about border security. They're claiming that terrorists are coming over the border. Well, this plays right into what happens in Congress when members of the House say, well, we're not going to vote for anything until we get border security. We're not going to vote for immigration reform until we can secure the border or until we can build this giant border fence. And that's just putting the cart before the horse. You're never going to get that border fully secure until you deal with the underlying problems that make it
which are trade pacts that Bill Clinton started with NAFTA and CAFTA, and Obama seems intent on promoting, and Republicans love because they get all of their money from corporate America, and the corporate America loves these trade pacts that put people out of jobs. And the trade pacts, these treaties, are what's causing the overwhelming majority of these problems. Well, look, as this goes on, it's interesting to follow Fox News. I know you will. I do it to torture myself sometimes, just so I follow Fox News so the people I do stories on, they don't have to follow it. So, but what I'm seeing right now is Fox News talking about how the border is not secure and we have ISIS kind of terrorists crossing the border. I think they did 3 or 4 stories on that last week. Are you seeing more and more of that?
Yeah, and the entire source for that story is this militiamen down on the border who are these guys who claim that they are talking to border patrolmen who are telling them this privately. But the Border Patrol, of course, is saying, no, we haven't done anything. You know, what they're saying is that what Border Patrol is doing is sweeping these radical Muslims up and putting them and incarcerating them, but hiding all the records.
Yeah, and we don't know about it. Yeah, that's so typical of Fox News. David, thank you for joining me, okay?
You bet.
David Neiwert is the author of the book, And Hell Followed With Her. We need to take a quick break, but we'll be right back. I'm Mike Papantonio. You're watching Ring of Fire on Free Speech TV. Hi, I'm Mike Papantonio, host of Ring of Fire on Free Speech TV. The corporate-controlled media rakes in millions of dollars in profit every year by only telling you half of the story. They're at the mercy of their corporate sponsors, and they refuse to take on corporations that kill, maim, and harm consumers. Here at Free Speech TV, we don't have shareholders. We don't answer to corporate America, and we don't pull any punches. Our loyalty is to the viewers, and our viewers are the ones that help keep Free Speech TV alive. Free Speech TV doesn't take corporate money, and that's why your financial support is so important to us. Viewer voices, not corporate sponsors, fuel Free Speech TV and drive many of our programming decisions. You can help protect Free Speech TV with your donation. Free Speech TV airs independent news and views for independent thinkers like you. Our people-powered programs demonstrate what's possible in our democracy when we unite as workers, as students, as artists, as parents, and partners in progress. More people means more power. Each donation brings more power in programs and more possibilities for change. Our programming equips viewers with vital tools, resources, contacts, and examples of how to collectively build alternative, sustainable solutions to serious community problems. Please donate now and bring these organizing tools into your community. Everyone should have access to news and information that's forming the world around them. Our goal is to keep you and everybody involved. We aim to reach every viewer possible because we're all in this together. Go online to freespeech.org and help support independent, honest news journalism. Your support helps keep information flowing, and together we can hold the corporate media more accountable. Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. The FDA recently came up with new rules for how drugs are marketed to doctors, but loopholes in the rules are going to allow drug companies to omit the very important information that sales reps should be telling when they sell the products. No need for the sales rep to disclose. Based on what we've seen from sales reps in the past, this could lead to devastating consequences for American consumers. Joining me now to talk about that is David Haynes. David, the FDA just amazes us again. I mean, again and again and again. It's become really a useless, just almost a joke of an agency. Tell us about their latest. When I read the article, this is amazing.
This is the latest proposal to a change in their rules that essentially the sales reps of these pharmaceutical companies are going to be able to tell the doctors whatever they want, basically, are going to so-called be able to educate them about off-label risk reduction. Essentially, it's going to allow the pharmaceutical companies to lie right in the office. Well,
in other words, right now you have, as the law is, you at least have some control over a detailer, a drug salesperson, going out and saying, look, doc, the label says that it only kills 10 people per 100,000. But the truth is, and this is my truth, is what the detailer would say, the salesperson would say, we know that that's not accurate. We know that it's a lot less than that. In other words, whatever the FDA says, the sales department's now able to come and say, well, it's not accurate. That's basically where this is now, isn't it?
That's right. This is a proposed rule, not yet adopted, but where this is going is exactly what the pharmaceutical companies want. Is instead of the peer-reviewed literature, the warnings that have gone through the normal FDA processes, they're claiming First Amendment privilege and that their sales reps should be able to minimize risk, explain away the legitimate peer-review studies, put out the studies that are basically sponsored and that they paid for within their industry, and by the way, promote the drug for a bunch of other off-label uses that FDA has not approved it for, all the while, meanwhile, taking the doctors out to steak dinners and dropping off catered lunches in the meantime.
Well, we already know, even with the law as it's written right now, we have drug salespeople that go up and they simply make up fantasy stories about what the drug will do or won't do. Now, the people watching this program may say, well, what about the doctor? Doesn't the doctor know better? Well, no, the doctor usually doesn't know better. The doctor is not even told the truth most of the time. The literature that the doctor gets comes directly from the company, and the detailer tells the doctor whatever the detailer wants to tell them, especially with this new law, while the detailer brings, it's some perky little sales rep, who brings them a basket of cupcakes and says, hey, doc, can we spend time talking about the drug? And then they say whatever they want to say.
Exactly, and the name says it all. I mean, these are sales reps. These are not PhDs in chem or pharmacology who are dropping off the basket of cupcakes or the catered lunch every day. They're sales. They're incentivized. And you mentioned about the doctors, and don't they know better? They're very busy. I mean, they have very busy practices. They're not able to wade through the literature and figure out what is legitimate and what is basically industry-sponsored literature for all these various drugs. And so a lot of times they are relying on the perky salesperson who's there in the office. And this is a very dangerous, slippery slope that could, it's going to create a lot of medical problems for the patient population if this is permitted to occur.
Well, one thing that happens now already, even without this ridiculous proposal the FDA is making, I mean, again, let's not forget, the FDA is supposed to be there to protect the consumer. That's what we think. And as a matter of fact, every time I pick a jury, I'll say, well, does it change your opinion about whether or not this company did wrong if the FDA approved it? Well, they'll all raise their hand and say, oh, yeah, if the FDA approved it. Most people don't know that the FDA, most of the money the FDA gets comes directly from the pharmaceutical company, right?
That's right. This was a new program that was passed years ago where the pharmaceutical companies wanted to roll out drugs that much quicker. The 2/3 of the funding for the approval process is actually coming from within the industry. And of course, we've talked about before on your program, this is a revolving door basically from FDA back to industry and back and so forth. But they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars to expedite the process. And we know when these drugs come out, the newer drugs, and they come out quicker and quicker and they haven't been properly vetted, those are usually the drugs that end up with black box warnings and are more likely to be
let's slow down.
recalled.
Let's slow down. You're throwing a lot at the listener. Okay, first of all, the organization, this PDUF, people they've never heard of it. But what it is, it's where the drug companies have the chance to pay the FDA to hurry up their drug. And I think that right now they get about 3/4 of all the new drug money comes from, and this is the pharmaceutical companies. The drug companies are paying the FDA to approve their product. Now, you use the term black box. Explain what a black box is so the viewers can understand how serious this is.
Well, that's the highest level of warning that the FDA gives at a risk of serious injury or death. And the problem is that a lot of times these new drugs that are being rushed through the approval process are not coming out with these appropriate warnings, so the consumer and the patient population is not aware of what the real risks are because they're rushed to market. Because as you said, the pharmaceutical companies are paying basically to expedite the process. And if you're an FDA reviewer down the street in Washington, and you know who's paying the bills, essentially, it's the company that has the application in front of you on your desk, and they're the one that is basically paying for your job. So obviously it's an inherent conflict of interest there, and these drugs get pushed out without the appropriate warnings, and then these are likely the drugs that we see that we have to put a black box warning, or the FDA does eventually, or the market or the product gets totally recalled.
Oh, okay.
From the market.
When a black box goes on a drug, it's because the drug usually has killed somebody, killed a good many people. And the FDA says, we got it wrong, we didn't warn about it, let's do this new warning, it's a black box. The drug companies hate it because it affects their sales as high as 30% to 40% sometimes. So they fight like the dickens not to have a black box. But you mentioned about this idea of the new drugs. Most doctors are saying don't ever, ever, ever use a new drug if there's an old one. What are the comparisons? Give us like the numbers. I think, used to be you'd rarely see a drug pulled off the market because it was killing people. You'd rarely see black boxes because it was killing people. Now it's almost like every other week there's some new black box. There's another product being pulled from the market.
Absolutely, and there have been some recent studies that have compared the drugs that have come off the market, have been introduced into the market before and after this expedited process that the pharmaceutical industry is paying for that you've discussed. So, many wise doctors will take the position that they much rather prescribe an old drug which has been on the market for a significant period of time rather than a new drug, unless it's a very innovative drug and there's not another a drug in the space, and it's a risk-benefit reward that has to be done. And often it's too much for the doctors to weigh. And then as we started out discussing, now we have the pharmaceutical sales reps coming in there telling the doctors, please, once you prescribe this drug, off-label and so forth. And here's
let's name a few right now. Okay, we're all in this with Xarelto, with Actos, with mesh case, transvaginal mesh, I can't even name them all right now that are in this under attack by consumers because the products are killing people. That's because the FDA again and again has dropped the ball. And right now, this is another example of why and doctors say this, a good doctor will advise their client, if there's another product on the market that does the same thing as this new product, and the other product on the market has been out there for more than 10 years, always, always, always stay with the old product. Do not listen to that advertisement that says, hey, new product, Xarelto, it'll, solve your atrial fib. Do not go with a new product. Did I get that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, low T and androgel and creating basically problems where they don't exist to prescribe these drugs. Not feeling as peppy as you used to 20 years ago, take androgel. So yeah. This is a systemic problem.
Yeah. David Haynes, thank you for joining me, okay?
Thank you, Pat.
Hundreds of thousands of concerned citizens across the United States took to the streets recently to promote awareness of climate change and to protest our continued reliance on fossil fuels. There's no question that we're burning down the planet, and we can't afford to sit back and simply wait. Joining me now to talk about this is investigative journalist and author Greg Palast. Greg, you know, it's amazing to me. 400,000 people show up in New York City of all walks of life. They're worried. I mean, everything from the clergy to, to mom and pop soccer types to people business owners that are losing their businesses because of climate change. But 400,000 people in the street, and it's as if ABC News or CBS never, like nothing ever happened. It was like, okay. But now, if you'd have taken 15 teabaggers and had them holding up signs of the president depicted as a monkey, you would have had CBS and ABC all over the story. What's your reaction to that as a journalist?
Welcome to my world. For those who know Greg Palast, I mean, my work is exiled to BBC television out of London. Most of my reports are front page on The Guardian. They're all over the planet, everywhere except the United States, where real reporting bounces off the electronic Berlin Wall, which is why Ring of Fire is so extraordinary. You actually have real information, real news. I mean, it is amazing. We have like the three monkeys: hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil about the elite establishment.
Well, there's a reason. Here's and you've said this before in a lot of some of the books that you've written and some of the interviews that I've seen you do, is that the decisions aren't even reached by the reporters. The decisions on what stories to cover, where to send your cameras, who's going to be the front page, that's all decided by the MBA that has no journalism background, sitting on the 50th floor of some building that says we can't upset our advertisers. So for sure, don't go out there when Exxon is a major advertiser. Don't go out and cover the story that 400,000 people were out in the street because they're so damned afraid that the planet is melting. Whatever you do. And that's been your experience on stories that you've covered. Chevron, I think, a good example.
Yeah, big spikes. I mean, for example, I work with BBC, which is a not-for-profit television station. The Guardian's a not-for-profit paper. But then you take something like PBS, the Petroleum Broadcast System, and you talk about Chevron. Chevron is the official sponsor of the PBS News Hours. And so, for example, when the BP, when the Deepwater Horizon blew up, Chevron's president was put on PBS, of which he's the main official corporate sponsor, was put on PBS to say, oh, Chevron would never do that. We have a wonderful culture of safety. These are the guys who basically pooped all over and crapped all over the Amazon.
Well, what that was a paid political announcement that PBS allowed Chevron to do without ever saying this is an advertisement. They allowed the BP president to get on and say, just make things up. I mean, we knew, we watched it. We knew that the president of BP was lying, making facts up. The reporters that were interviewing never asked the first question, why? Because, as you say, media is owned and operated now, and the only chance for survival for real stories, like the march that just took place in New York where 400,000 people show up, is people like you and people like Ring of Fire and people that are willing to actually do stories like this.
Yeah, what we're called the so-called alternative news. There's no alternative news. It's either news or not.
Right.
And so, for example, the marches would be on the front page of every paper in the world, except in the U.S., where it got, the page 4 treatment. And that's the problem, is that we become invisible.
You've made news on this very idea of climate change up in the Arctic. Talk to us about what you see happening with what's going on up there. It's all part of this story. But again, you're reporting it, we're reporting it, but you won't find the story on what we call corporate media. It used to be called mainstream media, but they're losing numbers by the millions. People are saying, this isn't what I want to be a part of.
Yeah, they're turning off. I went up to the Arctic for Channel 4 television, again a not-for-profit network with huge. It's like BBC in Britain and in Europe, and for Arte, which is the big European channel. But I went up to the Arctic Circle, met with the Eskimo leadership, there who are fuming mad that because of global warming, see, we all talk about global warming as a terrible, disastrous thing. And for normal humans, yeah, that's true. For all the mammals on this planet, including human mammals, that's true. Global warming is a serious threat. But to an oil company, you have to understand that for the first time, Arctic waters are now ice-free year-round. And so, for example, Shell and BP have already received approval to begin drilling offshore in the Arctic off of the Arctic wildlife, the ANWR, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. I mean, it's quite stunning because the environmental groups fought George Bush Jr. and previously Sr. to a standstill because they wanted to drill in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in ANWR, which is this massive untouched area of tundra. The thing is that now Obama said, okay, we won't touch ANWR, but we'll drill offshore. I'm talking, when I say offshore, I mean a few hundred yards offshore.
Mm-hmm.
And that's even worse, because if you have a blowout in the Arctic, like you had Deepwater Horizon, or you have a ship go out like the Exxon Valdez in the water, as you know from the Exxon Valdez, which destroyed 1,200 miles of Alaska coastline, you get oil under the ice pack. It's going to flow to Norway before you can get a hold of it. And so it's even worse than drilling in the wildlife refuge is to drill just offshore. And by the way, there are wildlife in that waters. Whale, the Eskimo told me, look, we don't hunt whales. They're a few a year. It's not a kind of a cultural event for us. It's lunch. They survive and eat.
Okay, so the drilling's going on and it's made possible by the very president that this week will be talking about how important the environment is and how we can do better. And I've got about 1 minute.
Yes.
Tell me, what in the hell is the psychology of this guy? How have we been so wrong about Obama? How have the people that out there thought this is the guy, he's going to, in about 50 seconds, tell me, what's your quick take on it?
I think he's scared. I've been watching a lot of issues, including him standing by with his hands in his pockets while governments like Argentina have been picked apart by American financiers. I see him allowing the oil companies to turn global warming and the ice sheets melting into profit centers, letting them drill where the ice has moved away. I think he's afraid. And I think that any American president is going to be threatened by the big powers, whether it's big oil, big finance, and other interests.
And you know what's so bothersome, though? It used to be Democrats that took care of standing in the way. What we need is another Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt would say, hell no, and if you want to test me, bring it on. This Obama is not the guy for that. I can tell you. And this story about global climate change will continue growing, and this president will do very little about it. Look, Greg, thank you for joining me, okay?
You're the best, Mike.
The payday loan industry has come under fire in recent months for preying on the poor in times of economic crisis. But new reports show that the industry is doing far worse things to underprivileged Americans, and I have attorney David Hersh with me to explain what's happening. You know, it's amazing to me. American banks are going to make money any way they can, even if they have to do business, as we see happening with these payday loan scammers. First of all, explain what payday loan is and what it's doing to the American consumer, would you, Dave?
You know, Pat, payday loans are, in fact, a scam. They lent, in the last year, the statistics were available, $40 billion in payday loans. This is to usually the members of our society who don't have a banking relationship. So they go to these storefront locations. And the last statistic I saw said there are more storefront payday loan locations than there are Starbucks and McDonald's combined. A $40 billion industry that generated over $7.5 billion in revenue. And what they do is they provide liquidity to people who can't quite make it to their next payday. So they loan against their forthcoming paycheck at exorbitant rates and then collect the money regardless of the financial well-being of the person who's doing the borrowing. So for example, you'll have a short-term loan. The typical loan is $375. Typically, it's due within a couple of weeks. But the interest rates on these loans, the interest rates, and this is not a typo, okay, 300 to 500%. Typical interest rate on a payday loan to the people who don't have an established banking relationship, they can't go down to their local bank and cash a check, 300 to 500%, and people are strapped financially. And the real problem comes, most of the time, folks have a hard time repaying those loans at the end of the 14 days or at the time of the next payday, so they renew those loans. Of course, the interest rate gets jacked up again, and they get into a vicious cycle of never being able to catch up with their own paychecks.
You've got the people out there, and it's a ridiculous argument when you think about the harm that it's causing these people. These people never get out of debt. They just never, ever get out of debt. But the argument the payday loan people make is, gee whiz, there's no way they could get a loan anywhere else if it weren't for us. Now, that argument sounds good until you start looking at the stories of what 300 to 400 to 500% interest in a 2-week period does. Basically, they never get away from the payday loan. The payday loan starts taking more and more of a percentage of the little money they can make to where there is no benefit. What bothers me also about this story, though, is that you have the national banks. You have the big Wall Street banks that are now getting involved, even though regulations say they may not be involved. They should not be involved. What's your take on that?
Federal regulators have taken a look at over 56 million transactions. And what they find is that these basically state-regulated payday loan operations that are very loosely regulated are in cahoots with the national banks. And the national banks are giving them access to national databases where the payday loan provider can actually go into a customer's account and deduct the money directly out of it, even though that's a direct violation of federal regulation, even though that is directly contrary to what the federal government says our federally chartered banks can do. And the trick bag of all this is that when the distressed individual who needs the money to make it to the next payday goes to the payday loan storefront right there next to the pawn shop or the McDonald's, and they sign the paperwork that has this microfine print on it, one of the things they do is they sign away their right to file a lawsuit. And it's not disclosed. It's not what's required.
Well, it's called arbitration. Explain how ridiculous explain how meaningless arbitration is.
Well, and so what's happened is that the banks, who theoretically aren't a party to this contract, are forcing people to go to arbitration. That means in order to fight what's happened, the person who's gotten the payday loan, who can barely afford life as it is going to have to pay to file for an arbitration. They're going to have to pay for an arbitrator. The bank is going to get to choose who the arbitrator is that makes a decision. It becomes a private backroom deal where they get a decision in secret and nothing is ever revealed. Now, no one, Pap, who's in a position where they're having to borrow $375 just to make it to the next payday is going to be able to afford an arbitration. They can't fight the banks.
Let me show you how ridiculous this thing about arbitration is. As a matter of fact, they're trying to use arbitration with everything now, but for payday loans. Here's how it works. You get your payday loan. The payday loan company could absolutely, they could misbill you, they can overbill you, they can do anything, and when you catch them, what they do, now this is how crazy this thing called the arbitrator. They may as well just have an employee that works in back of payday loans that comes out to the front desk. That person is then the arbitrator of who's done wrong, who's entitled to win. Under the statistics, the consumer never wins. If they win, it's like, it's less than 3 or 4% at best on any, and most of the time that's simply a mistake. But so right now, the person that goes to that payday loan agency, it's all stacked against them. And now add to that, Wall Street has gotten involved to stack it against them. And the Department of Justice, what have they done about this? Who's gone to jail? Who has been prosecuted for this?
No one's gone to jail. Come on, Pap, you know better than that. There's big money at stake. Of course no one's gone to jail. Interestingly, a small study was done over a very small slice of time about one payday loan operation, Ace Cash Express. And over a period of a couple of months, they determined that there was over $5 million. $5 million of inappropriate fees have been extracted, and they were fined another $5 million. But now people have to go through a whole process to try to claim some of that, and that's just a small snapshot in time. And no one's going to jail. No one's paying the price on this. It is such a lucrative business for which there is no regulation, no enforcement, and no access to the courts, that the people that are stuck in this endless cycle of payday loans have no recourse.
Can't you bring, for example, couldn't you initiate a class action against them? You can't even do that under the law, can you?
You cannot initiate a class action. Part of the reason is, well, we have decisions from our Supreme Court that limit and virtually eliminate consumer class action cases, number one. Number two, we have arbitration clauses that have consistently been enforced so that the banks, Wall Street, the investors, as well as the payday loan operations have the ability to force you to go to arbitration. And as you said, it ends up basically being someone who works full-time for the payday loan operation who makes the decision about whether or not what was done was proper. So it's a totally stacked deck. There's no access to the courts.
Dave, I saw a story that appeared on one of the TED presentations. It was brilliant. It was actually delivered by a multi-billionaire, almost a gazillionaire, I guess the way you would call him, more money than he could ever spend. He came out on this TED Talk and said, you know what's wrong with these kinds of stories? Is because, and he was talking as a billionaire that says, I'm worried about me. I'm not making a moral judgment here. I'm worried about me because at some point, people get pushed. They get trampled on. They get hammered to the point to where, you know what, at the end of the day, all that happens is they bring out the pitchforks. We've seen it happen in Europe. We've seen it happen in Asia. And we're kidding ourselves. In about 30 seconds, we're kidding ourselves, aren't we, if we don't think it's going to happen here?
We're absolutely kidding ourselves. We are setting ourselves up for class warfare because disillusioned people who don't have a recourse in the courts are going to end up doing something at some point, and that's not going to be asking for help. It's going to be getting the pitchforks out. It's going to be, unfortunately, violence in the streets.
It won't be letters to the editor, will it? Thank you for joining me again. Interesting story. It's the kind of story people just don't hear enough about in corporate media. Thank you.
Thanks, Pap.
It's been 4 years since the corporate Supreme Court handed down their decision on Citizens United, and we're now entering our third election cycle with virtually no limit on corporate money. We're going to talk about what it actually has accomplished for corporate America and for the Republicans. Joining me now to talk about the damage that Citizens United has caused our democracy is Joe Cotchett. You know, Joe, you and I have done several segments on what we thought was going to happen with Citizens United. We were guessing, we were surmising what would happen. And now the votes are in. Now we actually see the history and the things that you were talking about. I wish I could almost juxtapose the interviews that we did with you earlier and show what you were saying then about what was going to happen and compare it to what's actually happening. Give us a quick rundown. What is the history showing the net effect of McCutcheon and Citizens United?
Well, the net effect of all of this, as you know, Citizens United, let's go back and review it just for one moment. What Citizens United said was to the citizens of the United States that corporations are citizens too. And you'll recall the facts of the case were very simple. Citizens United wanted to go out and show a film called Hillary just before Election Day, essentially. And they were stopped from doing that by a district court saying, look, we have laws in place that restrict how much you can spend. Can you spend it on political, this, that, what have you? Bottom line is Citizens United came down and said in a 5-4 decision, said there are no limits on what corporations can do as long as they identify themselves. People forget that Citizens United was a unanimous decision on identification, 5-4 on how much you could give. Now, fast forward to a case called McCutcheon. But before I fast forward, let me say this. Citizens United has been devastating because the Koch brothers can now go out and spend multi-millions of dollars through their corporations with no restrictions whatsoever. That's the devastating part of Citizens United. It has been so bad that in states like North Carolina, see, they got down onto the state level. That's really where it was going because of redistricting. They got down into the states, and in the past year, the numbers are outrageous. There's something like 15 Republican state legislators were defeated. Over 480 Democratic state legislators were defeated during this period of time so that they could redistrict. Now,
well, let me point something out. Let me point something out. Okay, what was interesting about those numbers, the numbers are staggering. It's a staggering difference. But what was presented to the Supreme Court, and we forget this, in both McCutcheon and both Citizens United, is the argument was that that is exactly what would happen, that you would have one party would be heavily loaded, then the next thing that would happen is the redistricting would take place, and that party would almost be impossible to unseat. Those things were argued to the Supreme, and they knew, Alito, Roberts, Scalia, Thomas, all knew that that's what was going to happen. That's why they allowed it to happen.
Absolutely. Now, look, whether they knew it was going to happen, allowed it to happen, or what have you, the fact of the matter is they allowed it to happen. And in fact, everything that was argued came true. You're absolutely right, Mike. That was the effect of Citizens United. Now let's go to McCutcheon. McCutcheon is very interesting. McCutcheon follows, and by the way, I want to talk then about a trilogy, a third case that is coming along. So what do you have in Citizens United? You go up to the bulletin board and you write down, corporations are people, they can contribute as much as they want as long as they identify through a PAC. Now, let's go to McCutcheon. McCutcheon was an individual who was limited because he gave his maximum limits to, I think it was 16, 17 people, and they said that was an abuse of the First Amendment, freedom of speech. I think it was Roberts who said that, who wrote it, and said you cannot restrict a person as to how much money they can give to each candidate. Now that was devastating because that means that now a human being can go out, a citizen can go out and give as much money as they want within the overall limit, to one candidate. So you can imagine now the money that can be spent in these local races to devastate a party in any given state. You can get 10 millionaires to come into a state and change the total political landscape. Now, by the way, you should know in Citizens United, Justice Stevens wrote a 90-page dissent that he read out loud in the chambers. He felt so strongly about it. Now when we go to McCutcheon, you have justices that are like this with each other in a state of uncivility, the likes of which I haven't seen in my lifetime because it's such an important issue. Justice Breyer, who wrote a brilliant dissent, called the majority's opinion the invitation to open corruption. Open corruption in this country. Now, I said there was Citizens United, where they could give unlimited amounts as long as they made their voices known. And I don't want to get into the details of the Hillary picture and how they did that. Now we go over into individuals. So you've got corporations, now individuals, that can now give up to their limits, total limits, to one candidate, two candidates, or three candidates. They can't be restricted. Let me tell you what's winding its way through the courts. The trilogy is coming. Citizens United, McCutcheon, and now is coming a case. It's either going to be called Hersh or whatever name makes it up there first. And the third case is going to combine Citizens United with McCutcheon and tell us there can be no limits whatsoever.
At all.
At all. Yeah. And that's the third one that's coming, Mike. And it'll be here in our lifetime.
Scary stuff, Joe. We're out of time, but it's phenomenal how you've called this from day one. You've been calling this correct, and that's why it scares me when I hear you say that it's going to explode even to this third level. Thank you for joining me. Okay.
Thank you, Mike.
That's it for this week's Ring of Fire, but you can keep up with us throughout the week online at ringoffireradio.com or on Twitter at Ring of Fire Radio and on Facebook. I'm Mike Papantonio. We'll see you next week right here on Ring of Fire. Hi, I'm Mike Papantonio, host of Ring of Fire on Free Speech TV. The corporate-controlled media rakes in millions of dollars in profit every year by only telling you half of the story. They're at the mercy of their corporate sponsors, and they refuse to take on corporations that kill, maim, and harm consumers. Here at Free Speech TV, we don't have shareholders. We don't answer to corporate America, and we don't pull any punches. Our loyalty is to the viewers, and our viewers are the ones that help keep Free Speech TV alive. Free Speech TV doesn't take corporate money, and that's why your financial support is so important to us. Viewer voices, not corporate sponsors, fuel Free Speech TV and drive many of our programming decisions. You can help protect Free Speech TV with your donation. Free Speech TV airs independent news and views for independent thinkers like you. Our people-powered programs demonstrate what's possible in our democracy when we unite as workers, as students, as artists, as parents, and partners in progress. More people means more power. Each donation brings more power in programs and more possibilities for change. Our programming equips viewers with vital tools, resources, contacts, and examples of how to collectively build alternative, sustainable solutions to serious community problems. Please donate now and bring these organizing tools into your community. Everyone should have access to news and information that's forming the world around them. Our goal is to keep you and everybody involved. We aim to reach every viewer possible because we're all in this together. Go online to freespeech.org and help support independent, honest news journalism. Your support helps keep information flowing, and together we can hold the corporate media more accountable.